You're here to see some things about Azure DevOps Pipelines for BI projects. Along the way, in fact, before that, I'm going to talk about using SQL database projects and some practices for that. So you've seen this 100 times already. I don't really care if you get up and your phone rings like crazy. Well, you're much more important than I am, so go on and answer that question or that phone. I am going to pitch this one, though. How many are involved or know about a local user group in your area, right? And if you don't, and you've been here, just come to this, like, go and find out where they are. If you're not already registered on pass.org, go and sign up there. And go and find the virtual groups that are aligned with your interests. And you don't get a lot of spam out of them. They are really great. SQL Saturdays are also a great thing. And these are also great opportunities for you to become speakers and do this kind of thing. So I'm a user group leader in the city that I come from as well. So that being said, I'm a Canadian. How many people know what the second flag below there is? That's the province that I'm from. That is Manitoba. And the third, the blue circle with the, anybody know that one? That is the logo of the Winnipeg Jets hockey team. So I'm from Winnipeg. You guys are going to get an NHL hockey team here in Seattle too, so good for you. I work for a company called Imaginet. We have offices based in Winnipeg and Dallas, and so I do some traveling between those places as well. Please do fill in your session evaluations. There's prizes for this. It also helps provide feedback for us as speakers, so really glad to do that. Okay, so I am going to cover a little, just touch briefly on SQL Server Data Tools projects, SSDT, and very, very little on the analysis services and in integration services packages. And then we're going to go and build a DevOps build pipeline, and I'm probably not going to build a release pipeline, but I'm going to show you a couple of pipelines that I've done. So one thing I'm not covering the ability to deploy Power BI. If you're interested in deploying Power BI, you should go see Jens' session, which is also happening in this slot, and I'm not sure where he is, Jens Vesterhagen. He's talking about the REST API with Power BI, so go see him. I asked him if he would pitch my session in his thing, but he didn't say that. So anyway, I'm not going to cover reporting services reports. The deployment story on them from an automated perspective is a little nasty. And I'm not going to talk about Azure Data Factory, although you can do DevOps processes with Azure Data Factory. And it's kind of a cool way to do that as well. Okay, so want to talk, when I talk to customers, it's what's your pain? What kind of pain do you have? I was recently on a project where there was a data architect who was saying he was responsible and he had for the database schema of a data warehouse. He was saying, yes, we have a Git repo that we keep all of our scripts in, but it was not very well organized, that repo, and it was not very well adopted by the other developers on the team. So when it came time to actually deploying a database update, he was basically the only one that could do that. And it was really clumsy, error-prone, and most of the time you really didn't know where the most recent or what's the gold schema for the database, in this case the warehouse. It was really hard with multiple developers, and when it came down to crunch time, when we were trying to finish off features to display or to demonstrate to business users, if we found something and we had a problem with it late in the game, it was really chaotic to try and get a fix or a feature rolled out really quickly. So it landed up with lots of ad hoc manual deployments, and just not great situation. So the other thing I tend to ask is, can you answer these questions about where is the code for the production environment, for your production database? Do you know where that schema code is? Do you know what version of the code has been deployed to the production database? What about the latest one, the development code, or what's in test right now? Where is that code exactly? And here's the other mystery question. I found this stored procedure that references a table or a column that doesn't exist anymore. What's up with that, and how long has it been like that? Anybody have these kinds of pain problems in your work? Okay, I should say anybody not have any, because we don't kind of want to sheepishly say that it doesn't happen. It happens to me all the time, right? But this is fairly common in the kinds of things I see. Just a brief word about SSDT, or the SQL Server Data Tools. They are free from Microsoft. They are part of the Visual Studio install as of 2017 and 19. And you don't have to have a Visual Studio license. You can use the Community Edition of Visual Studio for this. And you just have to check off the data storage and processing workload when you in the installer. And then you also go to the Visual Studio Extensions Manager inside the Visual Studio and go look for project support for integration services and analysis services and reporting services. If you're looking at Visual Studio 2017 and earlier, there's a separate SSDT BI package, an install package that will install the project types for these other things as well. So these are free. There are lots of great tools out there, from vendors that help with this experience. Redgate is one of them, but they cost you money, and the licensing is expensive and things like that. So, but some really great use cases for them as well. But I'm going to focus on the free one. I am going to work with. I have a couple of very, very basic Visual Studio solutions here. I have one solution that has a sample database project and a sample tabular model project, or an SSIS tabular project. Very, very trivial. I'm going to focus mostly on the things I do with the sample database project. I have another solution for the SSIS project. And when we get to the compile steps, I'm going to sort of explain a little bit more why I put that one separately. But it tends to work better that way. Okay. So I want to, how many of you are using source control now for databases? How many are not using it? Yeah. Are you using SSDT database projects? Who are using those now? Yeah. They are, I'm a big proponent of them. They give you source code, version control. And in Visual Studio, you could compile your objects to catch those things, like the references to unknown objects, right? The other thing it gives you is refactoring support. Now I'm going to focus on that one, because this one is oh yeah, it kind of makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside when you see this. Because the alternative means, generally what it means is that your database objects become very brittle. You don't want to change a column name or a table name, because you don't know where else it might be used, and so on. So, and the SQL database project is considered a desired state configuration type of, it has, this is the way I want my database to look. Other products use a migration state, right, where you have some kind of base schema and then a series of migrations that allow you to change the schema from one version to the next. I prefer this approach, and other people prefer the other approach. The challenges with, say, a database project is that you don't actually have data in there, right? So if you're writing a stored procedure or tuning a query in a view or something like that, it's a little more challenging to work with actual data. And so it's hard to debug if you don't get to see execution plans or optimization suggestions like the Management Studio would give you. Yeah? It includes the stored procedures. Yeah, tables, all the schema objects that are in there. Yeah, we'll see what all it includes. Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're not using TFS, we're using Azure DevOps, but it's like the cloud cousin, right? anyway, I was a TFS guy from like way back. I went to Beijing in 2003 to teach Microsoft consultants in Beijing about TFS at the time. So I don't know what version of TFS that was, but it was a long time ago. So I'm a long-time TFS guy. We're going to work at ways to do that. So I'm going to show you an SSDT database now in my solution. Here's my Visual Studio solution, and nope. There is my zoom it. There's the solution over in the corner there. It's got a sample database and some objects in it already. Not much in there as well. If I look at the product table here and I open it up, it's got a bit of a designer view. It also has a script view of this particular thing, this particular object. So product table, store table, and so on. But what I've been doing is actually working in a sandbox database on my own instance of SQL Server on my own machine. So let's just go over to my localhost box. And I've got a sample database dev of that. And it's got a few more tables in there. It's got a control.change tracking table. It's got a country table. It's got, so it's a few, I've done a few changes in there as well. So, and just to show you as well, one of the things we want to talk about here is, it would be helpful if okay. So I actually have some data in here as well. And I want to talk about refactoring support in terms of preserving data in your target deployments as well. So, so you'll see that my product table name, I've got some column names in there that aren't the best. I am a stickler for naming conventions, but not the ones that have data types and things built into them, right? I don't like the underscore DTs or all the prefixing and suffixing and underscores and things like that. I like, camel-cased or Pascal-cased names that are full things with like, what is that, cat? Is that cat as opposed to dog? Or you might look at the next one and go, subcat. Okay, you probably mean category and subcategory, right? I don't like those as names. I'm going to actually use the category, the name category and things like that. So those are the kinds of course, I primarily work in business intelligence, so I like to have names that are more consumable by businesses, right? Your mileage may vary. You might have other opinions on this, but I like my object names to be descriptive, not so highly encoded that you have to have the wizard hat on to figure out what the whole thing means. Anyway, so those are some of the things. So what I want to do in order to get those changes into my database, into my project, is I'm going to do a schema comparison from within my project. So I'm going to say do a schema compare, and my source for the schema compare is going to be that database locally, my sample DB dev database. And my target is going to be this project, the sample DB project. So that's my source code, and I'm going to go click on compare. Now it's going to go off and look at all the objects that are in my sample database, my dev sample database, which is my personal sandbox, and it's going to compare it to what's in the project, and it's going to come up with a list of things that are different between the two of them. By default, it doesn't show the things that are exactly the same, right? So come on, let's keep going here. So here we go. So it's got a couple of, it says there's changes to these tables, and I can see down here what is the change. So I've changed these columns to be not null, as opposed to what's here that are nullable. Okay, let's look at this store table. And my one in the database has got store name and store number. And in database project, I have name and number. So it's identifying those as two different sets of columns, not a change to an existing column. So what this compare tool wants to do is add these new columns and drop these old columns. And I don't really want to do it this way. I know, I made that change, so I know that I just didn't like the word name and number. I wanted to qualify it with the word store. So I'm actually not going to bring that table in that way. I'm going to exclude that one. And it's found some other the other table and a couple of other tables there. It found a procedure called set new projects, and it found a role and another schema called control. So I'm going to bring all those things in there, and I'm going to click update. And it's basically going to script out those things. And if we look over here, we're going to see a bunch of things showing up. There we go. So now we see the country table has been added. The product table has been, there's a little checkbox there. I mean, that's been checked out. This is all in source control as well. So I have, and the stored procedure is in here as well. Notice down here in my errors list, I've got a couple of warnings here. Procedure set new targets has an unresolved reference to object dbo.target. So let's go take a look at that. If I double click on this thing, it's saying, oh, you've got this stored procedure and it references dbo.target, but there is no such thing as that in this database project. Is that really what you want? And so this is kind of the kind of orphan stuff that you might find in legacy databases, and you go, well, geez, this is never going to work, right? Should I get rid of that? Probably I should. In fact, I dislike this thing so much that I don't really want to consider that as a warning. I want that to be an error. Fortunately, if I look at the properties of this, and in the build side of this database project, if I click on this box here to treat transact SQL as warnings, if I click that there, then I'm going to get those down here are now going to change into errors down here. And the other thing that an error means is that I can't go and successfully compile this project anymore. If I was to say go build, it's like, no, the build is not going to, it's going to fail because we have these errors in there. Okay, so I actually want to go and fix that. And the fix for this in this case is, yeah, that stored procedure doesn't actually belong anywhere, so I'm just going to delete it entirely from the schema. And so I've fixed that. And now if I go and do a build, the build is going to say, okay, where's my build output here? It's actually built this, and it has some output here, sampledb.dacpack. Is the build output of a SQL database project, right? We're going to use this later on when we go to deploy this out to a system. Okay, so how do we manually publish this change? So database projects have this publish option where I can say, okay, set up, go to a connection. I've actually got a similar database on my local database called test, which is similar style of this. And it's going to go and examine that using a tool called SQL package in the background. And I can either generate a SQL script that gives me all the changes required to bring it to the desired state of this project, or I can go and click publish, which actually generates the script and then goes off and does it. I'm just going to do the generate script for now and see what kinds of things are going to happen with this. As it's doing that, now it's essentially doing another comparison and going through those stages there to figure out. And it's generated the script, but before I look at the script, I just want to, oh, look at that. Why did you do that? Okay. I forgot one step. I'm going to back up a step. Before we talk about publishing, I'm going to back up a step here, because there was a few things that I wanted to do, right? I want to talk about database refactoring. So in this store table, right, we talked about this store and store the name and number. So I'm going to say store name, make that change there, and change this to store number. Okay, and I don't know if you can see, but I'm going to zoom in on this over here. See this refactor log? This is now, oh, that's brutal. You can't see it anymore. This is a little file that is generated, and it contains all the refactoring operations that have been applied to this database project. So it says here I've got a rename refactor operation. It was on the column called store.name, and the new name of that is store name. So it's keeping track of this. We're going to see that used in the deployment process later on. So I did that through this interface here, but over on the product side, I'm going to show you that the better way of doing it here is in the code here. There's a right-click refactor rename, and I'm going to change product or name to product name, capitalization like that. And there's a little checkbox here. It says preview changes. And that's kind of a cool thing, because have you ever wondered where this column is being used in other things, in stored procedures or views or whatever? This is a great little thing that will tell you exactly where it is. And by the way, it found it in a view called bi.product, and it used to look like name as product, and now it's changed it to product name as product, right? So it's going to go off and apply those changes. I'm going to see the same thing here for refactor rename on category. Okay. And another on subcategory. I didn't know that the editing in the designer would actually create refactor, but it did. But what it didn't do is go and find these other references. So that's why I kind of now my recommendation is use the refactor rename. So the other kinds of things that you have here, and we're not going to go into them too much further, but there's a move to schema. So if I wanted to change this table from one schema to another schema, this is a great way of doing it, because otherwise it's going to be drop the old table, create the new table, and suddenly your 1 million row table is gone, and your system runs so much faster now. I'm also going to do something here, and I'm going to add right in here a product URL, which is a varchar 100, not null. Okay, so did I show you? I showed you the product table that had data in it already. So now I'm going to add a column here in the middle of this table that is not null to a table that has data in it. How am I going to deploy that? Anybody have any, like this is going to be hard, or am I stupid, right? How do I do this? Well, I'm going to do this. So let's see, now that I've made those changes to this one, let's go and see what that publish does. So if I right-click and choose publish, connect to my test database, and generate script. By the way, my pipeline later on is going to use these exact same kinds of steps. It's just going to be command line driven, right? So if you learn how to use the publish here, you're going to learn how it works in the release pipeline later on. Okay, so it's created I'm going to look at the preview of this, which kind of gives me the largest thing. Some of the highlights up here, it's going to rebuild the product table, and which means you're not going to lose data, but it is going to create a copy of it and then move some data, and then drop the old table, rename it, and so on and so forth, right? It's saying, oh, I found these rename actions that I'm going to do. There's some things I want to create. And by the way, there's some warnings down here. Product URL must be added, but the columns has no default and doesn't allow null values. So this alter script is probably going to fail. Same thing for category, product name. All these ones that we added as not null, these could be potentially failing things. So what do I do about that? Well, so there's something really cool in the publish. So let's look at what the publish actually created. This is the big script. Here is the SP rename objects to go from store.name to store name. And then creating some roles and schemas. And here is the rebuilding of the product table. It's creating a temporary product table with the new structure that's not null, and then it's going to do the insert from the product table into the new table. Going to drop the product table and do a rename, and then a commit. Yes?
Is it possible for it to deploy like separate files, like item formatted files independently and deploy it that way? Or is it always?
It always just creates this one big massive script. Yep. And beyond that, then there's some other creation tables, right? So standard kinds of things. Look here in the bottom here, it's adding a table called refactor log, which has basically got an operation key. And that's how it tells whether these refactor operations have been already recorded. So in this case, the refactor operations that are in the log are getting added to this refactor log in the database itself. So this helps for the package tool later on. It goes and looks for these things correspondingly and says, okay, this refactor has already happened. I don't need to do it again. Okay, so I probably, if I was to run this, I know this is going to fail, right? Because of that product URL, it's going to be bad news. And the reason that it wants to do a rebuild is that I specified that product URL was a column that was added right here between product name and category. Now, in Transact SQL, you can't do an alter table add column and tell it in which order that column goes, what ordinality of that. I can't do that. MySQL, you can do that, which is kind of cool. I didn't know that. I'm a Microsoft guy, but I went and used MySQL, and I was like, hey, I can put it in the right spot. Anyway, get with it, Microsoft. We could do this. But let's say that I don't, at the expense of doing a rebuild for the sake of having the column in the right order in the database, I don't really care that much about that, right? We shouldn't rely on a specific ordered set of columns in the database itself, because we're not doing a select star, right? Nobody does a select star here, right? So if we can avoid that, and let's say, I don't care, add it to the end. That's all right. My source code has it in the order that I like it. So that's my golden copy of the schema now. So I'm going to trust that instead. So fortunately, there is an option for that, and I can then avoid the table rebuild as well. So when I go and do this, I'm going to do another publish, because I actually haven't run that, right? I'm going to do another publish like this to the test database, and I'm going to look at these advanced options. So here is, on the ignore page, there is ignore column order right there. Okay, so I'm going to check that box off, which makes things a lot simpler for adding new columns. The other thing is those pesky defaults, or the new non-nullable things, right? And so there is an option here called generate smart defaults. And it's an option there where, when applicable, if I check that box, the generate smart defaults will say, okay, for something where it was not a null before, and now we're doing a migration to a not null, we're going to add a default value of, say, empty string for like a varchar or something like that, or a 0, right? So it's like a 0 or equivalent value going in there, but then it drops the default after that, and then all new values are going to have to do that. So we might have to do some patch code to update those from like empty string or something like that, which I'm also going to show. Okay, so I'm going to check that box to say use the generate smart defaults when applicable. Okay, and I'm going to generate that script. It's going to go through and do the same comparison on the same product database, or the sample database, the test one that which is also local. And it has data in it as well. So I'm going to look at my preview to see, now I don't have that table rebuild for product anymore. It's going to rename, the same kind of rename and control, and we're going to do an alter statement for that one. And I have no more warnings down here about potential data loss, right, for those ones. So let's see how it actually accomplished that. So most of this is very, very much the same. I have the same SP renames, role, schema, and then here is, instead of having, now we have, okay, here's my product category, setting it to an empty string where it's currently null. that could be 0 rows for all we know. And then it adds, does an alter column on that one saying varchar 50 not null. So that's just making that not null. It does the same thing for product name. It does the same thing for SKU and subcategory. And then here's the new column for product URL. It's going to add that one, and it's just adding it, and it's going to end up on the end of the column list. It's going to create, it's using a default of empty string for it. So after that alter table statement, all the existing rows will have an empty string for product URL, and then it goes and drops that constraint after the fact, right? And then the rest of this thing is all exactly the same. So that's kind of nice. So those are the kinds of things I would recommend you doing. So other common things that I do inside database projects. So I had that country table in there, right? And let's say that that's like a reference data table. And the very first time I deploy this somewhere, I want to make sure that I have my reference data in there. So I'm going to add a scripts folder in here. Every database project can have 0 or 1 post-deployment scripts. You can also have a pre-deployment script as well. You can have as many scripts in there as you want, but I'm going to use a post-deployment script. So after the schema has been updated, then these are actions that are going to take place afterwards. And I have some demo code in here that I'm going to do. So let's look at, I'm just going to copy some reference data into there. So here's a reference data script that inserts into the country table some values. And I just didn't say, give me all these values, but I said where those values are not already in the country table, right? I don't know how many times this script is going to run, but this is an idempotent script now. It's never going to make duplicates of Canada, Australia, England, so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to write these things as idempotent things because I could be generating this script dozens of times. It could be executing many, many, many times as I'm doing deployments over time. The other option is to use something like a merge statement where you can do matching on certain things. You can do updates as well. But basically, the gist of this is you can add these things in afterwards, and you always want to write them in idempotent fashion. So to get that script to actually run, this is SQL command mode, so I can say just reference this file here called, in the same folder called reference data. And it's going to go and embed that script in the post-deployment part. The other thing I might want to do is have some default security. One of the things I don't script in database projects is users or their role membership. I'd prefer that to be something that a database administrator does because there's usually has to be linked to a login of some sort, right? Pain in the butt to do that here. But if I do have some standard, well-known users out there, rather than try to link them up to a login, I'm going to just make sure that they're part of a standard group. So this script here, again, says if that known user called sample user is out there, add them to the role, sample role. And the nice thing about SP add role member is if that user is already a member of that role, it just says, fine, you're good, right? It doesn't throw an error if it's already a member, and you're not going to be a member twice, right? So, so that's common thing I'll do as well. I'm going to add that one to the post-deployment script as well. I'm going really quickly because I want to get on to pipelines, which is hopefully what you really wanted to see me do. But I'm on my soapbox about database projects, so and it's my session and not yours. Data patches. I was in a project where we were constantly doing data patches, and you didn't know if the data patch was going to get run in QA or test or wherever, or in prod eventually, and who had the latest patch and blah, 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 blah. So we said, how about we put it in the database project itself and have it run out that way? So I'm going to show you the way that I accomplished that one as well. So in my data patches, my master data patches script, I'm just going to reference all the individual data patches that I put in a folder here. And I usually name them according to like when the patch was written and what it's about, right? This was about that product URL. Here's what my patch looks like, a very standard pattern. I have a variable called patch name. That's a SQL command variable. And the first thing that the script does is check to see if that patch is already in control.change tracking. If it doesn't exist there, I know that this patch has not been applied. So then I'm going to go and say print that patching, that thing. The print statements here end up in the deployment log. When you go and do the deployment. So this helps you to understand what's going on here. I'm going to update the product table and setting the product URL to be this kind of thing. Maybe I should add where product URL equals quote, quote. And then at the end of the patch, I also insert that patch name into the change tracking table so that I know that I never run this again, right? So again, these patches are idempotent. They run once. If you run the same script again, it's not going to do it again, right? So if I was to do that, and now I go and add that one to the refer patches, data patches. Okay. So now now that I've done that, I'm going to just double check that, okay, I don't have any errors. I'm going to do another publish. And also I'm going to show you that I can save that, instead of just going and say right-click publish, I can actually save a publish profile along with the project itself. And it's got a bunch of the options already set for me. So I'm going to say, we're going to publish this one out here. I'm just going to check that I've got my generate smart defaults on. Yes, I do. And my ignore column order. Yes, I do. So when I go and generate this script, we're going to get a nice clean post-deployment script that's coming up here, or sorry, including the post-deployment script. So everything else should be the same. The first parts of it should be no table rebuild. So let's see that the table rebuild. Yeah, same work with product. And then once we get down here to the refactor log, here's my post-deployment script, and you'll see that it's embedded all these other scripts in there. So it adds the reference data. It does the known default security, and then the patch as well, and then the update complete. Okay, I could run this against my test database and see it run. What I want to do right now, and I'm going to cross my fingers that it's all going to work later, and that my magic is going to be strong on a Friday afternoon on the last day. But here's all my changes okay, whatever, that'll be fine. These are all the changes that I'm going to check into my repository. Demo changes. I would make a much better message than that for posterity's sake, but nobody's going to see me do this one. So I'm also going to push that one up too. So I have a Git works with a local repo, and then I can link it to an external repo, which is up in Azure DevOps. So the last step there to push was to push my local repo changes up into Azure DevOps. Okay, so some recommendations there about database projects in particular. A, use them. Please use them. But B, use a sandbox database and use schema compare to sync those database changes there. Along with that, use the database refactoring that's there, especially with table and column renaming and moving to a different schema. Those three are very powerful. Look at the defaults in the publish profile. Use smart defaults, you ignore the column order, and then other things like be careful about the things it might delete. So you can tell it to keep your target database clean by deleting other objects that don't belong there because they're not in the project, but be careful about that. Some of those things might kill things that are otherwise needed. And in post-deployment scripts, use those for things like initial state or reference data. Use those for default roles, default role memberships, and you write your data patches there. And then you know that they'll get applied in each environment later on. Okay, on to pipelines. Everybody's going to go home and start using database projects, right? Good, okay. Enough of you nodded politely to say, okay, move on now, Mike. Azure pipelines, just because now that we have these database projects and they will fail to compile if they have bad references in them, right? We can do these things to find code issues early with Azure pipelines. They allow us to deploy assets consistently from a source code repository in an automated, repeatable way that isn't relying on somebody who might get hit by a bus tomorrow or tonight after work that is going to do the big deploy tomorrow. It allows us also to maintain clearly defined environments between integration, test, pre-prod, prod, and so on. And it can also help with a lot of auditing of things, right? Who changed what changes were checked in by whom, were they associated with work items or tasks that are in the database or in DevOps and so on. But the biggest thing is that DevOps pipelines and the whole idea about continuous integration is that it allows for change, right? So that the database project and those kinds of things aren't brittle, and they allow us for change. Did you get that one? I like those. I like that slide too. So he was taking a picture of the slide. I'm going to use Azure DevOps. There are other tools out there that do continuous integration, but we're here to talk about Azure DevOps. It is a service from Azure, and you find it, go to dev.azure.com. And the first 5 users are free. You can have unlimited stakeholder users, so they don't get access to the repos or the pipelines, but they do have access to all the work items and all the other things that are there. And so I'm going to focus on a little bit on the repos, but mostly on the pipeline section in Azure DevOps. Okay, so there are 2 kinds of pipelines in Azure DevOps. There are build pipelines and there are release pipelines. The purpose of build pipelines is that they compile the source code to create artifacts like that DACPack file that we saw when we did the build. And then the release pipelines are for the purposes of taking the artifacts like a DACPack file and deploying it into one or more environments and all the steps that are required for doing that. So in terms of compiler output, what are the kinds of tools that we need in order to compile these projects? There's different types of projects, and the 3 that we're dealing with today is these database SQL projects, analysis, AS projects. Actually, I'm not sure that that's the right extension, but that one here. And integration projects. That was the SSIS project. I didn't show you that, but it's just got one package in there. And when I did the build step in Visual Studio, underneath the covers, Visual Studio has a tool called MS Build, which will build most project types. And so SQL database projects and analysis projects are MS Build compatible, and the output of those 2 is a DACPack file, or in the case of an analysis project, an AS database file. Integration projects are not MS Build compatible, so we have to use the command line of devenv.com, which is the Visual Studio executable, and it generates an IS-pack. And I tell you that because when we get to the release pipe, or when we're looking at these build pipelines, I can't use the same task for compiling the integration project as I can for the other 2. Okay, I'm going to actually, no, I do want to talk about this now. When we're talking about release tasks for taking those artifacts and deploying them to an environment, my standard rule about anything to do with DevOps pipelines is if you can do it from a command line without having any user interaction, then you can do it in a pipeline, right? So you just have to kind of know what the tools are that you would use from the command line. So you can do all these things without using Azure DevOps Pipelines, and you can automate all this kind of stuff, but I'm just showing kind of the guts underneath there. The DAC deployment tool is something called SQL package. And if you go look at SQL package there's quite a bit of documentation on how it works. But essentially, it takes a DAC file and a profile file that I showed you, and a target, and says, okay, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to generate a change script? Do you want me to generate a change report? Do you want me to actually apply those changes to that target database? Same thing with the analysis services. Tabular projects, there's a command line tool called Microsoft.analysisservices.deployment.exe, which in your shortcut is called the deployment wizard. Doesn't even say anything about analysis services. And the IS pack files, there is an IS deployment wizard executable tool that takes those and basically says, okay, connect to this place and deploy it. So underneath the covers, we're not actually going to see any of these three executables, but underneath the covers, I want you to know that those are the things that are getting used. Okay, so my scenario is I've got these projects, and maybe I want to deploy them onto an on-premises network. Inside my own network, there's a firewall around it. I have that SQL database I want to deploy onto a SQL, this is a 2017 server. And I have an SSIS catalog on that server that I want to deploy my IS project to. And I have a tabular server on there that I want to deploy that. The key to that is actually having an Azure DevOps pipeline agent installed inside your network. That installer, that agent, actually just runs a whole bunch of command lines for you. But it's also connected outbound up into Azure DevOps through an HTTPS connection, a standard connection outbound, so you don't need configure any firewall rules for it to work. It just connects up there, and it waits for commands from Azure DevOps. I also maybe have the same scenario in my Azure subscription. I have an Azure SQL database. I have an Azure Analysis Services server that I want to deploy to. I have an Azure SSIS catalog, which is hooked up to Azure Data Factory, which has a little bit of complexity there, but if you do lift and shift for SSIS and running them in Data Factory, you'll know what I'm talking about here. The wrinkle around that is that the integration runtime for Azure SSIS has to be running for you to deploy a package to it, which costs you money, unfortunately, but that's the way that goes. So that's my scenario. Okay, so I'm going to go now into Azure DevOps and show you, here is my Azure DevOps repo for this project. I have my DevOps sample solution, my sample SSIS solution. The sample solution references this project, the sample database project. So there's my control tables, scripts, security, refactor log, and you see that it just, oh, look at that. It did get checked in earlier. I'm looking at the wrong branch. Let's go look at the right branch. Okay, I was practicing last night. So here's my branch. The refactor log got checked in 10 minutes ago, and a bunch of objects in here, they also got checked in 10 minutes ago. And really nothing much else changed here, but I'm going to go to my pipelines and my build pipeline. I'm going to create a new pipeline. What I like to see right now here is I see all those green little arrow things here. It means everything's good, which means that my build that happened like a few minutes ago actually just ran successfully. But I'm going to show you those steps afterwards. So I'm going to create a new pipeline, and there is the new way of building pipelines is to use this markup language called YAML. You see, I'm kind of gray and old. I don't like it yet. I didn't even like Git for a long time. So I'm going to use the classic editor. Besides, it's much easier to demo the classic editor because you can kind of see things stepped along the way. But YAML isn't all that hard to use. It's just a little uglier than this one. So the first thing it asks you is where is your source that you want to compile? And I'm going to say it's in this project. There's the BI DevOps repo and my master branch. That's what I want to build. And I can start with a template. There's a bunch of templates. I'm going to actually use the .NET desktop template. It's pretty close. There's a few extra things that it does that I'm going to delete that I don't need, but I'm going to start with that one. So here's the pipeline, and the pipeline itself says what pool of agents do I want to run on. I'm going to use an Azure hosted pipeline. I can also create an on-premise pipeline a agent as well. When I choose the Azure Pipelines one, I have so many minutes per month of build time allowed for free in that 5-user free subscription, and you can buy additional ones after that. But look at all the options for what the agent specification will be. This one is going to by default use the Visual Studio 2017, Win 2016 one, but you can compile on Mac OS, Ubuntu, and so on. For other types of projects, in this case, this is the best one for me to use. And I'm going to go and say I want to deploy that particular solution is the one I want to compile. Okay, the next step is going to go out and get the sources. Where do the sources come from? And then I have this agent job, which is going to run on the agent that got selected from here. And there's not much to this, but it just is a collection of these things. NuGet is something that I don't need in this case, and I don't need a NuGet restore. Here's the first one that's of interest. So this is a Visual Studio build task. And it basically says, go and build that solution. If you want to give it some MS build arguments. So now it's saying this is a Visual Studio build, but it says, do you want to pass additional arguments to MS build? So why they didn't call this an MS build task, I don't know. And it really makes me angry because underneath the covers here, it is actually running MS build. Not Visual Studio. It's running the MS build version that's associated with the Visual Studio that's installed in their machine. It's not actually running Visual Studio. Okay, but that is what I wanted to do. I don't have anything to do with test assemblies, and I don't have anything to do with publish symbol paths. But what I do want to do is take the output that's in the bin files or in the bin folders of my solution, whatever projects I've got in there. I want to make sure that they are part of the build artifacts, right? So that DACPack file, in the case of the model or the tabular project, that AS database file. So I'm just going to make a small change here and say, okay, I'm going to find in any folder that has under the root of the source, this is my agent's working directory where all the files get downloaded to. Any folder underneath that has a bin folder in it, and any files after that, include those files and copy it to my staging directory. So this is a place where your artifacts were going to be put. These are the things that I want to come out of this build. And then the final step here is to publish all the things that are in the artifact folder into an artifact. Essentially zip them up and upload them to Azure DevOps. So the artifact name will be drop, and here's the path that I want to publish from, so that might start a staging directory. So that's the thing that I wanted to do. So that's going to work against that one. And if I was going to go and save and queue that thing, I'm not going to. It's going to start up, going to go and find an agent that's available and start this project, this process up on that agent. So here it's getting the sources from the repo, and I can see the things that are happening all. Here's my build solution step. It's going to run, and we're going to see some of this here. I'm just going to wait for something to come up here that's a little bit more of interest here. Okay, so notice it's found sampledb.sql proj. It's going to build that thing. In the cloud, on that agent up in Azure, yep. and it's creating a bin release folder. Here is the actual command line of MS build calling this thing. And notice, okay, it's gonna go real quick through here. So the rest of those steps happen really fast. So it's done now. I'm gonna go to, that's not the copy. I wanna go to this one here. And just sort of scroll in on this, I can see the full things that are happening here, right? So there's that DACPAC file, and it's found the, there's the SM project, is the tabular project, and there it creates that AS database file there that I'm really interested in as well. So if I go to the next task and see what files did it copy to that directory, it found 7 files, and really the ones I'm interested in is the DACPAC and the AS database files, but those other ones were also there as part of that one. And then the final step to publish that one said, okay, uploading those 7 files into this drop folder. So that's the output of the interesting parts of this pipeline. And notice I also have artifacts here, so I have a drop folder, and here's what's been published as a result of that one. So there's my DACPAC file, and there's my AS database file, right? So the other one, the SSIS project, I'm going to show you an existing build that I had for that one, just for the purposes of saving time. And I can't use the Visual Studio step because it's using MS Build, and MS Build does not support the integration services project. So I wanted to run the dev-env command line one. So I could have done that. I could have written there's a bunch of generic tasks for running command line things or PowerShell or just a ton of those things. You can do it yourself, but there's actually community tasks out there that people can go from the marketplace. So if I was to go and search for something like dev-env, just ignore that top one because that's an already installed one, but it's saying, here's a couple of things in the marketplace that you might want to consider, right? Build with dev-env or Visual Studio. Oh, I can actually go off and look at his page about that. Or there's this SSIS build and deploy, which also looks interesting. I've installed both these marketplace tasks, and I've used them both in this case. But here's the build solution with dev-env. And it's disabled at this moment. I just want to show you that version of that one. Basically, I go and tell it what's the name of the solution that I want to build, and then what version of Visual Studio do you want it to build, and so on. Same thing, the build SSIS task is part of that guy's thing, and it says it's essentially doing the same thing under the covers. It tells it what solution you want to do, what the configuration is, the path to that project file. And look, when I go and build this, where is the, that's not what I wanted to do. Why did it do that? Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, yes. So, that's not what I want. Okay. Very interesting. Okay. Yeah, that is, sorry, I'm thinking ahead about the release pipeline. So it points it to the repo, or the place in the repo that's there, and it does that one. Again, the copy task and the publish artifact task, exactly the same here. It's just this one is different because it runs dev-env instead. The other thing that I'll point out, and this one also runs in the pipeline, the agent runs in Azure. And so the first time I did this, when I ran the dev-env, it stopped for like 3 minutes. And it's like, what is going on? Actually, I thought it hung up altogether. And I've actually put in a ticket about this, and it's been a complaint for a number of years now. But devenv.com, the first time it runs headless, it wants to do like an out-of-box experience for to check what your subscription is. I don't know if you've run this. The first time you run Visual Studio, it says, hey, how are you? Do you want to sign in? All that stuff. When you run this headless, it's kind of doing the same thing in the background, and it takes about 3 minutes to decide that maybe you don't want to do that, right? So it just, everything stops. The funny thing is, if you do another task in the same agent job here that also runs dev-env, just the second one just goes through like crazy. It's just so no pause at all. So when you do this, if I was to queue this up, it takes about 3 minutes just to go and do that. So I guess I'll kick off one and show you what that looks like. But I don't really want to wait here for 3 minutes while this goes. But what I will show you is an earlier build of this one. And you'll see that the build SSIS step took 3 minutes and 51 seconds. And if I was to actually look at the build log for that one, each of these steps, you can actually go and look at the log and get like timing for every one of these. Like at the beginning of the line, you can see like exactly when this occurred. And at this point, it gets up to this point in about 2 seconds, and then nothing happens. This is the great black gap of nothingness here. This takes about 3 minutes, and then Visual Studio kicks in and does the rest of this in about 10 seconds. So thank you very much, Microsoft. I imagine there's some kind of Docker image that's running this thing, and they do an automated build, and they don't want to actually fire up the Docker image and run devenv.com once and then deflate the image. Although I have suggested that as a way that they could save us all 4 minutes of build time. Times however many times. But anyway, this is the man getting us with this money for build time. That's all I'm going to say about that. So it did succeeded. Anyway, so and we'll see that the published files here actually found that ISPAC file and put it up in that task. Okay. So now I want to move on to, well, I got 15 minutes left to talk about releases. Okay. I have, again, I'm going to start with a brand new release pipeline. I have 2 of them already built. Look at that. That's a green build. I love that. Okay. I am going to just use an empty template for now and show you that I have artifacts that I want to add to this release pipeline. So I'm going to take the artifacts from a build. And so what builds do I have here? I have my CI build from that standard analytics one. That was the other one that I was showing. And I'm going to add the other one from the SSIS one as well. That's my other one that has the drop that has the ISPAC file in it. And I'm also going to show you that this has a trigger for it to enable continuous integration. So anytime when this is checked on, every time a new build is available, this pipeline is going to fire, right? And then I can have what I want to do is add a stage. I'm going to leave an empty stage here. Come on, empty job. And my stage, I wish they had called it environment because that makes more sense to me, but I'm going to call this one integration, right? So this is my integration environment where the code that various developers have been working on go into. You can call it dev or post-dev, or I don't care what you call it, but make it make sense in terms of what kind of environment you're actually mapping it to. And then creating tasks. Again, where does the critical thing here is where is the agent going to run on? So if you want to deploy to your on-premises objects, you have to use an on-premises agent to do that, presumably. Otherwise, your Azure agent your pipeline agent is going to have to reach through your firewall to those objects and find them inside your network. You probably don't want to do it that way. So for on-prem ones, you're going to want to do an on-premise agent. Configuring an agent is pretty darn simple. Inside this tool, you go and find you go to the Manage Pool area and say, okay, I want to do this. In fact, it's easier if you do this on the machine that you want to install the agent on inside your network, and it downloads a zip file. You unload the zip file and run a configure command line thing and follow the directions. Bob's your uncle, it's all done for you, and then it starts talking up to Azure DevOps. It's really quite slick, quite capable. Okay, and then you go start adding tasks to this, and for the interest of time, I'm going to go back. Just going to abandon this. No, sorry. Leave. And look at my deploy to Azure sample that I've done here. So I've taken those 2 things, and I have an integration one with one job that has 6 tasks. So the first task here is to publish the SQL database. And you'll notice I'm starting to use these little variables here, which means it makes simpler for me to do this the same way in another environment later on when I want to do that one. So I can set it for how do I want to connect to the target that I want to deploy this database to. I'm going to use what's the SQL server name and the database, and how do I connect to it. There's the login and the password. I'm going to deploy from a DACPack file. And here's the options for this one, which is the same options that we had the otherwise. Publish connects to that one, actually executes that one. Script will create the script only, then it becomes an artifact, doesn't actually do anything. It's not that great. And the deploy report builds a rather unimpressive XML file that is not as useful as you might think it is. I used to include this step as a sort of one step along the way and then do a publish. I actually now just do a script and a publish as two separate steps, so that I have, because sometimes the DBAs that are angry and you have to find the right kind of bribe to get them to do anything, for them to allow you to actually execute things on their server. They want to see a script first, so sometimes you have to do that one. Okay, so that was a built-in task from Microsoft. The deploying to Azure Analysis Services, I can't just use that deployment wizard to do it because I can't do that non-interactively because of the Azure Active Directory authentication that's required to talk to Azure Analysis Services. So this task is a community task from the marketplace. This guy wrote it. Essentially, he's doing PowerShell script under the covers for this, but he's wrapped it up in a nice thing. So I can specify my server name and the model name that I want to connect to. How do I want to connect to that server instance? And where is the object that I want to deploy? So if I click on this, browsing, I see my linked artifacts. I go down and find the project here. There's my bin folder, there's my AS database, right? So that's the one that I want to deploy. It's also going to do this thing where it goes and finds the data source connection in that tabular model and can update it to whatever you specify. So I'm going to tell it that I want this analysis database to connect to the the Azure SQL database that I just also deployed, right? So they're kind of linked together that way. So there is the server that I wanted to connect to in the database, but I have separate credentials for the tabular model to connect to that one. So I've got those as different variables. Okay, yes?
Like, can you use the key, what's that key library?
Key Vault?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. So essentially, you can have a step here up at the front that says, go and load all the secrets from Key Vault, and then you can use those secret names as variables, right? So yes, you can. The question was, can you use Azure Key Vault for these things? And yes, you can. It's kind of slick, actually. The second thing I typically do after deploying an analysis model is to process it so it's queryable. And I try to do, so that's another step that this same package will give me, is to actually execute a script on that server. And here's what the script looks like. The latest ones are now JSON scripts for doing, so this is a process default, is what you would normally see. So this is the 16, 17, around there. They all started switching over to JSON format. The whole thing is in JSON and gone away from XML. The models too, yep. And then, so that's a common step that I also do as well. And here is my deploy of the SSIS package. Again, I give it the location of the ISPack file, and I can add additional project parameters to that one by specifying it in a JSON file. That's empty at this point. Where is the catalog database, the SSIS DB catalog that I want to do it, and what's the folder that I want to deploy it to? Where is the server that has that SQL server, and how do I connect to it? I've got a connection string that I want to connect to because this is an Azure connection. So I want to show you the variables that are here. So I have a number of variables, and what you can't really see here very well is that variables have a name and a value, but they also have a scope. And so the scope can be either at the stage level, that's 5 minutes, yeah, okay, or at the global release level. So most of these things I've actually got defined at the stage level. So things like, okay, so this is in integration stage, so my database or my data model name is going to be sample tab underscore int, right? If I had a prod stage, I might call it underscore prod, and so on and so forth. Also notice that I can store secrets in there, and they are like a one-way, write-only kind of thing, right? So, if I wanted to go back to my pipeline, I could actually, now if I'm ready to actually publish it to another one, another stage, I could do a clone of this, and let's call this production, I don't know, let's call that one. It's got exactly the same tasks, a copy of the tasks, and if I look up at variables here, I've got a little bit of some problems here. I'm going to actually just show this in grid view, which shows me by scope across the top. So I have my values for those values across there, but this is my production one is the problem. Yep. So some of these secrets won't have been copied across, right? So you have to fill in the secret values. But so if over here, this is the production one, so I want to call this prod. That's my model called prod. And the folder that I'm going to do it is called production. So it's going to, so you make the changes that are necessary in the variables so that it works easily that way. I'm also going to show you back at the pipeline that in this case, it's going to happen automatically after that stage the previous stage has occurred. If it's successful, it's going to go off and do that one. I could also add things like pre-deployment approval. Somebody's got to actually approve this one before it goes off, and you basically get an email with a vote in it saying you do that. Let's enable that one. I also have exit gates as well, post-deployment conditions. I can require a post-deployment approval, so somebody goes out and actually says, yes, I agree, this is a good build, and so on. So there's a ton of things you can do with pipelines, and I'm barely scratching the surface. I want to show you the on-prem one. I'm going to abandon my changes there. Deploy on premises, it's very similar to that one. Same setup here, but my on-premises agent tasks uses my on-premise private agent, right? So it's a private agent only by me. Nobody else can see it in my organization. And it's going to run inside my network. Come on. Okay. Did I just get rid of everything? No, I didn't. Go back. Deploy on-premises, edit. Okay. Okay. The same, it's essentially the same. This is an on-prem SQL deployment, and it's very similar. It's a task there. Connect to the server, and I can, if I have the agent running in a network account or even network service, it can connect using Windows authentication. So as long as your agent can connect, you can use Windows authentication. And again, here we just give it the DACPAC file and the publish file. The tabular SSIS, tabular deployment, is a little bit different. It is also a community task, and underneath the covers it uses the the deployment wizard executable to do this. And you might, if you've done that, you might notice some of these same options, right? Deploy roles and retain members, retain partitions, retain configuration, and organization settings for existing objects, right? So those are the kinds of things that you can do as well. You can have a step to update the data source, and you can have another step to process the data model. In this case, I'm not giving it a JSON script, I'm just doing it that way. This is the same community task that I used for the other one. It's almost exactly the same. And instead it just uses Windows authentication rather than before. Okay, so I did want to go and show you that here is the build that happened well after I checked in that code earlier. And let's see what the publish sample database looked like. It updated the database. It had, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to go, I think because it had 2 check-ins. Let's go back a step. Where's the early one? 610, let's go to this one, okay. Let's look at this one. Okay, so this is a little bit more interesting because my publish step now did some operation, some output, those print statements there, gave me some output here. So it did the rename, and it did the create statements, added the reference data countries, 6 countries added, patched that product, updated the database, successfully published the database, right? That was the, what was sample tab? Okay. Yeah, so this is the AS database deployment, goes out there. And the process step, it says it worked and deployed that package out there. Gives me a bunch of operations and things like that. So it tells me it did that deployment. So I'm going to see if we've got that one. Okay, I'm going to connect to, here's my Azure database. And I'm going to select star from dbo.product. Okay, good. I don't think that data was in there before. Okay, that's not that impressive, is it? Shoot. Well, it did the patch. I know it did the patch, right? So I should have checked that one earlier. So let's see if my store one is there. Okay. And store name and number didn't work either. Beautiful. Okay. The gods are not smiling on me because I've gone a minute and a half over. But let me just talk about that one. So just to wrap up my build pipeline that built the DevOps sample solution, used MS build under the covers and created those. The one that used sample SSIS used dev env under the covers. Copy the copy artifacts to the staging folder and then publishing those artifacts. Those are the same thing beyond that. The release pipeline, this one is essentially the same for both on-prem and Azure. It deploys those artifacts from the drop folder, from the builds, and connects, deploys the database, deploys the model, and connects and refreshes the data in the model. And then the second option for the SSIS package deploys it to the same task. The only thing is that the integration runtime must be running for that one. So I've just showed you the PowerShell down here to start up and shut down those runtimes. And I didn't show you, but my tasks actually had that as a disabled step, right? So it just takes about 10 minutes for that thing to kick off. So I didn't want to wait that way. By the way, I've uploaded the most recent version of this slide deck, and in a raw, you get the PDF, right? But I've also uploaded it in the demo section, and I think PASS has to approve it or whatever. But there's a whole bunch of hidden slides with all of the steps that I was doing in the demo as screen caps. So if you want to go back and go, man, that was going way too fast, you can download that slide deck and look for the hidden files, hidden slides in there. So my recommendation, start with the classic editor instead of using YAML. Unless you really feel comfortable in YAML, then just go ahead. The marketplace extensions are valuable to have. Most of them are also open source, so usually with the marketplace extension, they also have a GitHub reference to where the source code is, and that's actually kind of useful. You can see how they're actually doing that. What I didn't show you was using PowerShell and command tasks. Those are sort of catch-all things. If you can't do it otherwise, go and look at PowerShell and how to do that one. Define your stages to match your environments. Use variables to simplify the pipeline development. Allows you to clone an environment. And the other thing is, this is a really key one. Invest time early to develop the build and release type pipelines. They are a bit tedious to build, right? So, and they're prone to getting it wrong up front. It's like, how do I do that? And you have to do it. You might spend a day or two or maybe a week, depending on how complex your pipelines and your solutions are. But do that up front rather than late in the day or when you're trying to get release cycles out and you want to have quick release cycles. That's the wrong time to do it. And I've been recently in a project where I did that at the very end. Here's the marketplace extensions that I referenced here today. And again, if you download the deck, you'll see that one. Session evals, do fill those ones in. They help us out. You could win a prize. Thanks very much for coming. You've seen that guy all this week, so I put my face in there, although. So thanks very much for coming. Come back next year.